Take a seat. Annaby, please, we can invite you back on stage. We're just going to have a... Yeah, absolutely. I'm waiting for Annaby to get up. There we go. Wow, I think...
Oh, you want to sit in the middle?
No, I don't mind sitting on the one side. That's fine. And here's some water for anyone if you want, but it's a bit of a wobbly table there. There we go. So I think lots to absorb there, and I'm glad to say we've got questions coming in. So please keep them coming in, and we'll try and get through them before the lunch break. But maybe we can just start on some of the obstacles, Annaby, that are preventing us from moving into a circular economy at scale. Because it feels like we've been talking about the circular economy for many years now. We understand the benefits, we understand the overarching rationale, yet we're not moving at sufficient speed. And I mean, just to go back to the one stat that was mentioned, what is it? Tonnages not collected has increased by 14%. I mean, that's really a damning indictment. What are the obstacles?
Okay, if I can just start, I mean, for me, one of the main obstacles is what you said. We've been talking about the circular economy for the last 10 years almost. Maybe not quite 10, but nobody's said, how do we do it? Ellen MacArthur Foundation says, oh, we're going to go circular. And how? The legislators say, we're going to set the targets 50%, 55% by 2030. How? And really that's what CFLEX focuses on, is the how. It's not a simple question. It's not easy to do. It's interconnected. You get it wrong and you screw up one part of the value chain completely, or it just disappears because it's not there anymore. So, I mean, I think the missing element of that discussion is the how. And each of those bits of the circular economy puzzle that I presented today has a how. And that how is really dependent on the local conditions. It's not one size fits all.
I think I'll add on to what Graham is saying there, because between my bin, and I have a bin, all the way to the recycler, that haven't been thought through. We haven't seen changes there. I think it would be nice to ask here, how many waste management companies are in the room?
You can't see.
And they're a specimen that's absent in these discussions. We don't get them here. The industry is talking, the government is talking, but somehow that connection between my bin and the actual recycler, that is missing. That chain is not functional, it's not missing, because we rely now on other parties. We rely on the local municipalities. We rely on other players in that value chain. So the how is definitely a big challenge.
And I think just on that point, I don't know if it's related to load shedding, but we can't dim the lights. I'm aware that it is quite dark, and standing up earlier as well, it was a bit like speaking to a black box. But sadly, we can't do that. And if there is load shedding, the lights will go off for a few seconds and then come back on. And we're running the whole system on our own generator, and the lights are run on the hotel's generator. Just a bit of important load shedding housekeeping that. So then maybe just to come back, Annaby, to your point about that vision that you shared about shortening the value chain, doing more at one single point of operation. What needs to happen to ensure that we realize that vision of shortening the value chain? What do the various role players and stakeholders have to do under this idea of increasing collaboration and partnership?
Yeah, I think that the biggest player there is local municipality. Because if we're not going to have two bins, and I'm meaning those 30% that doesn't have a bin or a bag or a box that they can put their stuff in, they need to be in there. So we need to separate wet and dry. I think that's key. The other two grouping of people that's vital in this discussion is the waste picker, because we need the waste picker to sit with us around the table and saying, instead of me pushing my trolley and going for high value products, that is a reward for my effort, because he has so many hours in the day that he can pick. How to convince the waste picker fraternity to say, join us in this discussion and rather become little business owners within the big picture. And then the waste management companies, because currently they're the people that see opportunities and use it directly for their pockets. But instead of focusing on white milk bottles or focusing on clear PET beverage bottles, how do we get all recyclables in one spot? And I think that's the challenge. So local municipality is absolutely key. And then our waste companies, from the collector, the waste picker, to the management companies.
Graham, I know the context in Europe is obviously markedly different, but is there anything in the European example that we could learn from and perhaps implement here in South Africa to help shorten their value chain?
Can I continue? Is this still going to work? Yes, it is. Okay.
No?
I
Carry
can
on.
actually see there's people out there. Look.
right on cue. Wonderful. I think that's probably a bit of load shedding now, so the lights will be on in a few. There we go.
There's no, as I said earlier and several times, there is no one size fits all. I mean, in Europe, we have separately collected bags that are collected curbside, nice, clean recyclables that go to a sorting center, wonderful stuff. Still a percentage of manual sorting from there. We also have the mixed waste going back to the waste to energy facilities or landfills. And increasingly, we're seeing that there are technologies out there that allow you to sort the recyclables from that waste stream. And in some of the work that CFlex has just recently done in 4 big countries in Europe, analyzing we call it our compositional analysis study, understanding what's in the waste stream, we know that even in the best countries, and I'll put Germany up there with it, we see a significant proportion of the overall flexible packaging placed in the market is still in the residual stream. So if you want to go circular, you have to focus on that material. There is a technology to do it today, but if you're doing it manually, you can do it as well. So it's about not necessarily not being able to do it, it's about not being able to do it economically so that it's attractive for the people doing the work, either with equipment or manually, to be able to pick up that flexible packaging. Unless it has a value that's going to go into their back pocket, they're not going to do it. So we need to make sure that everything has an appropriate value that is equivalent to what we would like to happen with that. And the key to doing that is EPR fees.
You know, I inherently, as a quite liberally economic thinker, push back against regulation. But the example that you used, Annaby, was quite interesting of how do we create the right incentives? And back to your point, Graham, this will move because of the incentives. Where is the value? And then the market will find a way. It does look like the mention of the stipulation that 15%, I think of it, of plastic bags must be made. 50 must be made from recyclate, has created and stimulated demand. So in this sense, it does look like the right kind of regulation is having the desired effect. Would you go along with that?
I think I agree with you. What we see in the flexible market in South Africa is it's that the other markets are now staffed. And that should create then a bigger demand. But now you start getting to that uneconomical to collect. Because if a waste picker have to walk a long distance to get your small little peanut bag and your tiny little corner that it's not going to happen. So how do we get that less easy, that's an interesting term, less easy materials into the system? And it still need to be economical for my effort to bend down, but also economical for the system. But I agree with you. I think the demand and the legislation and demand, we've seen it now in flexibles. But how do we get that more difficult to collect outer areas, wider areas, more dirty? How do we get that now in such a format that we can bring it into the system? But I do believe legislation will do the job. In South Africa, the challenge with legislation is not everyone comply. And I think you've seen it. There are carrier bags out there without recycling. There's flat bags out there without recycled content. And that guy is at an advantage because he may not even pay his packaging levy. So how do we get that level, that playing field level, at what Graham was saying?
Yeah.
So if we implement legislation, the compliance have to come with it.
Yeah, absolutely critical. That there's a question from the audience here. I can't see who it's from, so please preface your questions with your name. We'd like to announce that as well. Is there a process, Annaby, to follow to fast-tracking establishing recycling PPPs at municipal level? I mean, is there a way, for example, to get COGTA involved? And maybe then I could, if we've got a roving mic, also just put that out to the DDG to see whether or not there is space for the department to play a facilitating role here as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely Plastics SA have started the process to talk to 3 different municipalities and 3 different provinces to see if we can have our idea of sorting in one place, at least a blueprint trialed and say, how do we do that? Municipalities, as we know, the decision makers change every 3 years. So the first year they say, don't contact me, I'm finding my feet. The second year they need to get as quick traction as possible. And the third year they say, no, I'm watching my back now. So it would be interesting if Mogale can respond to say, from government side without putting her on the spot here. But it's not simple. The various PROs looking at how to interact with the local municipalities as well to get that infrastructure in place that the minister was talking about. But it is a challenge.
Thank you. Do we have a mic for the DDG?
Thank you, Michael. Just to indicate that as part of our EPR regulations, we have included infrastructure support development. It was not part of those that we had targeted for 2022. So for this year, and we need PROs to collaborate with municipalities in terms of feasibility, because currently we do have existing infrastructure that might not be fully utilized, and in other areas we need a new infrastructure to be developed. So it's an area that we will be looking into. Just also to indicate that, yes, Graham spoke about how in Europe you have municipalities being supported from the EPR fees now, which is very critical, because when you talk separation at source, Annaby mentioned the 2 bag system, and the stats in terms of how far have municipalities gone in collecting, you can see that we still have households that are still not served. So the fiscus is constrained, but EPR is there to ensure that we lessen the administrative burden on government, and in this case, government being your municipality. So some of these fees that we've started to collect last year needs to go into that separate collection, and that's where these PPPs that we are now discussing are becoming critical. And because the annual reports that have been externally audited of the PROs and the producers will be coming in at the end of this month, we will be looking closely in terms of the performance. I think we will also be taking lessons from the established markets such as the EU in terms of the sticks that we need to put in place, because as Annaby mentioned, we do have some of the free riders that are not necessarily part of complying, and we need to strengthen, the arm of the law in terms of getting to them. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, DDG. And I want to throw it back to you, Graham, but there is one question that's come for the DDG. So while she's got the mic, if I can just put this to you, and then we'll come back to some lessons that potentially we could learn from the European market. At a State of Waste departmental sponsored workshop a few years ago, there was a waste picker representative who made really good contributions, and it felt like, to an extent, the waste pickers' contributions were spoken over. So can you just talk to me about the need to actively participate and listen to the waste pickers and bring them in as real partners here, and what the department's view is on that and how you're facilitating it?
Thank you, Michael. I think, when Anabi responded to say some of the key stakeholders that we need to bring on board include the municipalities, but also the waste pickers, because they are on the ground and they are contributing to the collection. We have recognized that in our legislation. Our national waste management strategy takes due recognition and acknowledge the valuable contribution that waste pickers are bringing in terms of ensuring circularity. We did not just stop there. Based on the history, and we've talked about how, bending down, there's an effort, and we need to recognize that even in a monetary sense, in terms of the service that the waste pickers are providing, in our EPR regulations, the producers will know that the deadline was November 2022 in terms of them ensuring that there is a service fee over and above the revenue that the pickers will get from selling the recyclables. So there has been challenges with regard to the, I would call it disbursement system in terms of getting that money to filter down. Some have started to receive because we need buyback centers to be connected to the payment systems such that the payments are linked to the amount of effort which would be informed by the tonnages that the waste pickers have collected. So we do have organized waste picker associations which we work with as a department. They also are part of the policy making space and some of the research that needs to inform the policy. So we've come a long way, and now with the EPR also recognizing that contribution, it's critical that they be part of the solution.
Thank you, DDG, and I think that clearly demonstrates with evidence that the department is engaging a whole lot more seriously and actively with the waste pickers. Hopefully that one conference was just an outlier. If we go back, Graham, to the lessons that we can learn from the European experience that you think would be able to drive us forward quite quickly, what are the big ones? What were the big challenges or obstacles that were overcome that we could really implement as a primary focus in South Africa as we look to almost leapfrog towards a circular economy?
I think there has to be a vision, and I heard this master plan referred to. I'm not familiar with it, so maybe the elements are embodied in that, but there has to be a vision that people buy into, that this is going to work for them. It's going to increase the value of their businesses. It's not going to put them out of business. And it's got to be doable within a certain time frame. That's got to be quite stretching. So you do need to set milestones along the route. We need to be here by then. And that means if you are going to have an EPR system and you are going to collect fees from the EPR system, those fees need to be ring-fenced to pay for what you want to achieve. They're also going to be aligned with what it's going to cost to make those changes. And if that isn't in place, well, then we can all go home because it's not going to happen. But for that reason, and this is why we built the criteria for circularity for EPR systems, it's about understanding who has the vested interest in making this work, and who should be telling the EPRs what's needed. And we've come to the conclusion that it's probably the brand owners and retailers, because they're the ones handing over the money in most often cases in different countries. And they have a limited ability to pass on those increases to the consumer. So they have a vested interest in doing it as efficiently as possible. If it's not the brand owners, and let's call it a governmental organization, then they don't have the same vested interest. They can just crank up the EPR fees indiscriminately because the collection of the EPR fees wasn't done well enough, less money came in, there's not enough money to make the systems go round. So you do need to design the system so it has the best chance of success. That's not easy, and it requires all parties at the table. One of the slides I jumped over because it was when I was coming to terms with the changed look and feel, is that CFlex has 180 companies participating in it in Europe. The combined turnover of these companies is, we stopped around about 100, when we got to 130 companies, is about 1.3 trillion euros. So it's big. We're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs and things like that. This is people collaborating because they need to make sure that their organizations are not disadvantaged by what comes out. They need to be part of the big picture so that it works for everybody, because there will be some losers, but for most of industry has to understand what they need to do to make this work. And that's why I believe people participate in CFlex, because they have to pay, but they get value out of hearing from other parts of the value chain, including the waste picker side of the things, as to what's needed to make this work.
And just to build on that, I mean, the process of developing the CFlex criteria for circularity, can you just describe how that played itself out, and how you managed to take into account the various role players and their feedback in developing this? Because I think that's important in getting everyone's buy-in.
Sure. I mean, we have some quite well-established EPR schemes in Europe and who've been operating for like 20 or 30 years. So we had their input, but we also had the brand owner and retailers participating in the discussion. And we had the end-of-life operators who do the collection, sorting, and recycling, and saying, well, how do we make this work? Why isn't it working today? Why isn't more flexible packaging collected, sorted, and recycled? Why isn't the infrastructure in the ground? And from those whys, we distilled these 4 criteria. How do you create the demand for these materials without writing it into legislation that you will have a 35% minimum recycled content, or else you're not allowed on the market? I mean, that's really using what we call a very blunt hammer, blunt instrument. But it's quite simple to do economically. You make it cheaper than the virgin. As soon as if you can make that equation work throughout the whole collection, sorting, recycling system, it's going to work. That's why it works for rigid plastics better than it works for flexible packaging, because there's more residual value, because there's just simply more plastic in the packaging.
Now, the incentives are perfectly right in that example. There's a great question here from Avashni at Safripol. And Annaby, you touched on standard development for recycling in South Africa. But how far are we as a country in developing our own recycling standards?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Easy to answer, but a very difficult one. From my records, there's only 3 recyclers currently that have their own standards, and you'll hear 2 of them after lunch, so don't miss it. And there's no demand currently, and funny enough, I had a long discussion yesterday with a converter on it, where I asked the converter, in other words, the user making the product, and saying, are you asking the recycler, what is your MFI, what is your density, what is the color? He said to me, no, if I do that, I'm not going to get material. So how do we get the recyclers? So to answer you quickly, we in the starting blocks, I think there's talking about how do we get standards in place. We have a standards writing at SABS, and I think we just need to start putting it in place, because it's not going to happen by itself. I don't think there's enough push for it or pull from the converter side to do that. So minute, 3 recyclers out of 300, that gives you the quantity.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, it's 12 o'clock. It's time for us to break for lunch. So again, a warm round of applause, everyone, for our speakers this morning.
Thank you.